Her son vanished into the desert 3 days ago. The richest woman in Silver Creek offered everything she owned to the cowboy with dead eyes and steady hands. He took her gold, mounted his horse, and rode toward the horizon without a single word of comfort. Now she stands alone on her mansion's porch, watching dust clouds swallow the last man who might bring her boy home. The wilderness has already claimed her husband. It will not take her son. Subscribe to witness a mother's war against the merciless frontier. Margaret Whitmore pressed her face against the cold window glass, watching the cowboy's silhouette disappear into the crimson sunset. Her breath fogged the pain as she whispered her son's name like a prayer. Thomas had been gone for 3 days now, vanished from his bed in the middle of the night, with nothing but his father's old rifle and a head full of foolish dreams. The servants had searched every corner of the estate, every barn, every hiding place a 12-year-old boy might choose. But Margaret knew the truth that clawed at her chest like a wild animal. Her son had ridden into the Badlands, chasing stories of gold and glory that danced in his young mind like fireflies, the same stories that had killed his father 2 years ago in those God-forsaken mountains. She turned from the window and walked through rooms that echoed with wealth and emptiness. Crystal chandeliers caught the dying light, casting rainbow fragments across Persian rugs that had traveled farther than most men ever would. Her husband had built this empire of cattle and silver, brick by brick, deal by deal, until their name commanded respect from Denver to San Francisco. But respect meant nothing when your child was lost in a wilderness that devoured men whole and left nothing but bones for the vultures. Money meant nothing when the only thing you wanted couldn't be bought in any store or negotiated in any boardroom. Power meant nothing when you were just another mother, broken and desperate, begging strangers to bring your baby home. The cowboy had arrived at dawn, recommended by the sheriff with words that carried the weight of legend. Jake Morrison, they called him, a man who could track a whisper across stone and find water in hell itself. His eyes held the color of winter storms, and his hands bore scars that spoke of violence survived and lessons learned in blood. Margaret had offered him $1,000, then $2,000, then everything she owned, including the deed to the ranch. He had listened without expression, studying her face like he was reading a map of her desperation. When she finished speaking, he simply nodded once and named his price. $500, and no questions asked about his methods. She had watched him prepare with the efficiency of a man who understood death intimately. His rifle was clean and oiled, his saddlebags packed with jerky and ammunition, his horse a steel-grey mare that seemed to share his quiet intensity. Margaret had wanted to give him something of Thomas, a photograph or a piece of clothing that might help with the search. But Morrison had shaken his head and told her that hope was a luxury he couldn't afford to carry. He would find the boy, or he would find what was left of him. Either way, she would have her answer before the week was done. The certainty in his voice had been both comfort and terror, a promise wrapped in the language of men who dealt in absolutes. Now the house felt like a tomb, filled with the ghosts of laughter and the echoes of small feet running through hallways that stretched like empty years ahead. Margaret poured herself a glass of whiskey from her husband's private stock and sat in his leather chair, surrounded by the maps and ledgers that had once defined their world. She traced her finger along the red lines that marked the boundaries of their land, following them to where they disappeared into the unmarked territories beyond. Somewhere in that vast emptiness, her son was either sleeping under stars or feeding the earth with his young blood. The not knowing was a special kind of torture, worse than any physical pain she had ever endured. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, each note falling into the silence like stones into a deep well. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember the last words she had spoken to Thomas, the last time she had kissed his forehead or scolded him for tracking mud through the kitchen. But memory was cruel, offering only fragments and shadows when she needed perfect clarity. All she could recall was the sound of his bedroom door closing and the terrible quiet that had followed. If Morrison failed, if her son was truly lost, she would follow him into that wilderness herself, because a mother's love was the only force in this world stronger than death, and she would prove it with her last breath. Morrison's horse picked her way through the rocky terrain with the sure-footed grace of an animal born to wild places. The trail was 3 days cold, but the boy had been careless in his excitement, leaving sign that even a greenhorn could follow. Broken branches marked his passage through the scrub oak, and his horse's shoes had left clear prints in the soft earth near the creek beds. The kid was heading northeast toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, following an old mining road that prospectors had abandoned when the easy gold played out. Morrison had ridden this country before, hunting men who thought distance could wash the blood from their hands. He knew every waterhole and every box canyon, every place where hope went to die under the desert sun. The boy's tracks told a story of naive confidence turning slowly to fear. For the first day, Thomas had ridden hard and straight, pushing his mount like he was racing toward destiny instead of probable death. But by the second day, the hoofprints showed hesitation, circling back on themselves, as if the boy had begun to question his grand adventure. Morrison found the remains of a small fire where Thomas had spent his first night, the ashes scattered by wind and the bones of a rabbit picked clean by scavengers. The kid had at least known enough to cook his food, which meant he might survive long enough to be found. Might being the operative word in a land where might was usually followed by a shallow grave. The sun climbed toward its merciless peak as Morrison followed the trail deeper into the Badlands. This was Apache country, though the tribes had been mostly driven onto reservations or into Mexico, mostly being another word that could get a man killed if he believed it too completely. The boy's tracks were joined now by others, unshod ponies moving in the careful patterns of men who knew how to hunt and how to hide. Morrison counted at least 4 riders, maybe 5, their trail weaving in and out of the boys like wolves circling a wounded deer. The story was writing itself in the dust and sand, and Morrison had read enough of these stories to know how they usually ended. He pushed the grey mare harder, knowing that time was bleeding away like water through cupped hands. The Apache might keep the boy alive for a while, especially if they thought he could be ransomed or traded. But they might just as easily kill him for his horse and rifle, leaving his bones to bleach in the sun like so many others who had ventured into this unforgiving country. Morrison had seen what remained of men who crossed the wrong Indians at the wrong time, and the images were burned into his memory like brands on cattle hide. He would not let that be the boy's fate, not if there was still breath in his body and bullets in his gun. The trail led up into the foothills where the air grew thin and the rocks turned red as dried blood. Morrison's horse began to labor in the altitude, her breath coming in sharp puffs that hung in the cooling air like small clouds. He could feel the weight of eyes watching from the ridgelines above, though he saw no movement among the scattered boulders and twisted pines. This was where civilized men turned back, where the comfortable lies of progress and manifest destiny crumbled like sandcastles before the tide. But Morrison was not a civilized man, and he had long ago made peace with the darkness that lived in wild places and wilder hearts. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Morrison found what he had been dreading. The boy's horse stood riderless in a small meadow, its reins tangled in a deadfall pine and its flanks marked with the white foam of hard running. There was blood on the saddle, not much, but enough to tell the story of violence and capture. Morrison dismounted and studied the ground with the patience of a man reading scripture. The boy had been taken alive, dragged from his horse and bound with rawhide before being thrown across an Indian pony like a sack of grain. The trail led north toward the high country, toward places where white men's maps showed nothing but empty space and the word unexplored written in careful script. Morrison checked his rifle and swung back into the saddle, his jaw set like granite and his eyes hard as winter ice. The real hunt was just beginning. Margaret stood on the widow's walk atop her mansion, a telescope pressed to her eye as she scanned the endless horizon for any sign of Morrison's return. The brass instrument had belonged to her husband, used for watching cattle drives and surveying the boundaries of their empire. Now it served as her window into hope and despair, magnifying distant dust clouds that might be riders or might be nothing more than wind-blown tumbleweeds dancing across the desert floor. 3 days had passed since the cowboy rode away. 3 days of sleepless nights and untouched meals. 3 days of praying to a god who seemed to have turned his face away from her family like sunlight abandoning a dying flower. The servants moved through the house like ghosts, speaking in whispers and avoiding her eyes as if grief were contagious. They brought her tea that grew cold on silver trays and meals that returned to the kitchen untouched. Margaret had dismissed most of them, unable to bear their pitying glances and careful sympathy. Only Elena remained, the Mexican woman who had helped raise Thomas from a baby and who understood that some sorrows were too deep for words. Elena would sit with her in the evenings, her weathered hands working at her rosary beads while Margaret stared into the fire and tried not to imagine her son's face in the dancing flames. The town below buzzed with rumors and speculation, each story growing more elaborate with each telling. Some said the boy had been taken by Apaches and was already dead, his scalp hanging from a warrior's belt like a trophy of war. Others claimed he had fallen into an old mine shaft and was calling for help from the bottom of the earth while his voice grew weaker with each passing hour. The most optimistic souls suggested he had simply gotten lost and would find his way home when hunger drove him back to civilization. But Margaret knew her son better than any of them, knew the stubborn pride he had inherited from his father, and the romantic notions that filled his young head like poison honey. She had tried to follow Morrison herself on the second day, saddling her mare and riding out toward the Badlands with a rifle across her pommel and determination burning in her chest like fever. But the foreman had stopped her at the gate, his weathered face creased with concern, and his voice gentle but firm. This was not work for a woman, he said, not country where a lady belonged. Margaret had wanted to strike him, to scream that she was not a lady when her child was missing, but simply a mother with claws and teeth and a heart full of savage love. Instead, she had turned her horse around and ridden back to the house, her dignity intact, but her soul screaming with frustration. The nights were the worst, when darkness fell across the land like a black shroud, and every sound became a possible harbinger of news. Margaret would lie in her bed, listening to the wind rattle the windows and the old house settle on its foundations like bones creaking with age. Sometimes she thought she heard hoofbeats in the distance, the sound of Morrison returning with her son safe in his arms. But when she rushed to the window, she found only empty moonlight and the mocking silence of a world that had swallowed her child whole. Sleep, when it came at all, brought dreams of Thomas calling her name from places she could not reach, his voice growing fainter until it disappeared entirely into the vast indifference of the desert. On the fourth morning, Margaret made a decision that would have horrified her husband and scandalized the town. She dressed in her riding clothes and strapped on the gun belt that had belonged to her father, a man who had carved his fortune from the wilderness with bullets and determination. If Morrison did not return by sunset, she would follow his trail herself, tracking him across the Badlands like a wolf following the scent of blood. The civilized world had failed her, its laws and customs and proper behaviors as useless as paper umbrellas in a hurricane. Now she would embrace the savage truth that lived beneath the veneer of respectability, the primal law that said a mother would follow her child into hell itself if that was what love demanded. Let the town gossips whisper about the rich widow who lost her mind along with her son. She would find Thomas or die trying, because living without him was not living at all. Morrison crouched beside the cold ashes of an Apache fire, reading the story written in charcoal and scattered bones. They had camped here 2 nights ago, 5 warriors and their captive, sharing the meat of a stolen steer while the boy sat bound and silent in the circle of firelight. The tracks told Morrison that Thomas was still alive, still walking under his own power when they broke camp at dawn. But the Apaches were moving faster now, driving deeper into the high country where the air grew thin and the trails became paths that only mountain goats and desperate men would dare to follow. They knew they were being hunted, and they were leading their pursuer into the kind of country where white men's bones decorated the landscape like scattered pearls. The trail climbed through stands of aspen that whispered secrets in the wind, their leaves already touched with the gold of early autumn. Morrison's horse labored in the thin air, her breath coming in sharp gasps that echoed off the canyon walls like the panting of some great beast. He could feel the weight of watching eyes from the ridgelines above, though the Apaches remained invisible among the rocks and shadows. They were testing him, measuring his resolve and his skill, waiting to see if he would turn back like so many others who had ventured into their domain. But Morrison had been tested before, in places where death wore 1,000 different faces and mercy was a luxury that got good men killed. The sun was a brass coin in the pale sky when Morrison found the first sign of violence. Blood on the rocks, not much, but enough to tell him that someone had been hurt in this place. He dismounted and studied the stains with the careful attention of a man reading his own death warrant. The blood was fresh, maybe 6 hours old, and it belonged to the boy. Thomas had tried to escape during the night, cutting his bonds with a hidden knife and making a desperate run for freedom through the darkness. The Apaches had caught him within 100 yards, and someone had paid for the attempt with steel and pain. Morrison followed the blood trail to where it ended at a small stream, the water running clear and cold over stones that had witnessed 1,000 years of violence. The boy's tracks showed that he was limping now, favoring his left leg where a knife or tomahawk had found its mark. But he was still walking, still breathing, still clinging to the stubborn hope that kept men alive when all logic said they should lie down and die. Morrison felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he had thought buried with his own son 10 years ago in a grave outside Tucson. The boy had sand. He would give him that, the kind of courage that got men killed, but sometimes got them remembered. The trail led up through a narrow defile where the walls closed in like the jaws of some stone beast. Morrison's horse shied at the entrance, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of something that made her wild ancestors run from predators in the night. Morrison dismounted and led her forward on foot, his rifle ready and his eyes scanning the rim above for the glint of steel or the shadow of movement. This was perfect ambush country, the kind of place where smart men turned around and stupid men died with arrows in their backs. But Morrison was neither smart nor stupid, just determined, and determination was sometimes enough to tip the scales when death came calling. The defile opened into a circular valley ringed with red cliffs that rose like the walls of a natural cathedral. In the center stood the ruins of an ancient pueblo, its adobe walls crumbling back into the earth that had birthed them centuries ago. Smoke rose from somewhere within the ruins, a thin grey line that spoke of fires and captives and the kind of patience that came with absolute confidence. Morrison studied the valley through his spyglass, counting shadows and measuring distances like a general planning a battle. The Apaches had chosen their ground well, a fortress that could only be approached from one direction and defended by a handful of men against an army. But Morrison was not an army, just one man with a rifle and a promise to keep, and sometimes that was enough to change the world. Margaret's horse stumbled on the rocky trail, her hooves striking sparks from the stone as she climbed toward the sound of gunfire echoing through the canyon walls. The rich widow had followed Morrison's trail for 2 days, guided by instinct and desperation through country that would have challenged seasoned frontiersmen. Her riding dress was torn and stained with dust and sweat, her hands bleeding from gripping the reins too tightly, but her eyes burned with the fierce light of a mother who had found her purpose in the wilderness. The shots came again, sharp cracks that bounced off the cliffs like the voices of angry gods, and Margaret knew with absolute certainty that her son's fate was being decided in the valley ahead. She dismounted at the rim and crawled forward on her belly, peering down into the circular valley where smoke and chaos painted the afternoon air. Morrison crouched behind a fallen log, his rifle spitting fire at the Pueblo ruins where muzzle flashes winked like deadly stars. Bodies lay scattered in the dust, Apache warriors who had learned too late that the quiet cowboy was more than he appeared to be. But there were still two of them alive, and they had dragged Thomas into the center of the ruins, where ancient walls provided cover and a clear field of fire. The boy was on his knees, his hands bound behind his back, and blood staining his shirt. But his head was up, and his eyes were clear. He was alive, and that was all that mattered in a world where hope was measured in heartbeats. Margaret studied the scene with the calculating eye of a woman who had learned to think like a predator. Morrison was pinned down, unable to advance without exposing himself to crossfire from the ruins. The Apaches were content to wait, knowing that time was their ally, and that eventually the white man would make a mistake that would cost him his life. But they had not counted on a mother's love, had not factored the wild card of a woman who would walk through fire to reach her child. Margaret checked her father's pistol, a heavy Colt that had killed its share of men in the early days when the territory was young and violent. She had learned to shoot as a girl, standing beside her father as he taught her that survival was not a matter of gender, but of will. She worked her way around the rim of the valley, moving like a ghost among the rocks and shadows until she was directly above the ruins. The Apaches were focused on Morrison, their attention fixed on the threat they could see while ignoring the danger that crept up behind them like death in petticoats. Margaret found a narrow ledge that led down into the Pueblo, a path that ancient people had carved into the cliff face for reasons lost to time. She began her descent, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. Every step might be her last. Every handhold might crumble and send her tumbling into the abyss, but she climbed down anyway because love was stronger than fear. The first Apache never saw her coming, too focused on Morrison's position to notice the shadow that fell across his back. Margaret's bullet took him in the spine, dropping him like a stone while his rifle clattered away into the dust. The second warrior spun toward her with a cry of rage, his tomahawk gleaming in the afternoon sun as he charged across the ruins with murder in his eyes. But Margaret was already moving, rolling behind a crumbling wall as the blade whistled through the air where her head had been. She came up firing, her father's Colt bucking in her hands like a living thing as lead and fury found their target. The Apache staggered, blood blooming across his chest like a crimson flower, and then he fell forward into the dust that had claimed so many others. Morrison appeared in the sudden silence, his rifle trained on the ruins as he searched for any remaining threats. He found Margaret kneeling beside her son, cutting his bonds with shaking hands, while tears carved clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Thomas was hurt, but alive, his leg wounded but not broken, his spirit battered but not destroyed. He looked up at his mother with eyes that had aged years in a matter of days, and Margaret saw in them the reflection of her own transformation from civilized lady to frontier warrior. They held each other in the ruins of the ancient Pueblo while Morrison kept watch. 3 survivors in a land that ate the weak and tested the strong. The rich widow had found her son. But more than that, she had found herself in the crucible of the wilderness where love was the only law that mattered, and a mother's heart was the strongest force in all creation.